So this is the fourth of the Klein lectures, Introduction to Melanie Klein. We're using Hannah Siegel's Introduction to the Work of Melanie Klein, and today I'm going to speak about chapters 3 to 5. These all concern the paranoid-schizoid position. As we know, one of the major differences between Klein and Freud is Klein's rejection of Freud's theory of primary narcissism. Instead, she sees sufficient ego existing at birth to experience anxiety, to use primitive defense mechanisms, and to form primitive object relations from the beginning. No primary narcissism. It's notable that on pages 24 and 25, Siegel mentions the death instinct, but it isn't at all clear what she means. Is this Freud's 1920 biological tendency to die, or is it his 1937 tendency toward disconnection or disintegration versus eros as a tendency to connect and to create ever wider integrations? Or is it destructiveness? Or is it an aggressive drive? Or is it a death wish? A death wish is a psychological phenomenon in the mind, not a psychobiological drive allegedly rooted in the body. So all of these are different interpretations of what is meant by this term death drive or death instinct. And you really can't tell what any Kleinian writer is meaning by these terms, except by looking carefully at the context, and probably often not even then. And I think that a lot of these writers may not themselves really know what they mean by this term. Therefore, I say forget the death instinct, and as I've argued earlier, it's extraneous to Kleinian theory, because on every page where Klein cites death instinct in order to explain why the infant must inevitably be paranoid, even with the best caretaking in the world, she always gives two explanations. One, the necessity to project the death instinct out, forming thus the bad persecutory breast, because the death instinct has to be projected out. But everywhere she says that, she gives a completely opposing, or a completely alternative, I should say, explanation, namely that due to the infant's cognitive immaturity, all frustration is felt to be an attack. The absent good breast is felt as an attacking bad breast. So since even the best caretaking can't prevent frustration, the infant is bound to be feeling persecuted, and there's no need for a concept of a death instinct in order to understand that. Certainly, following Wilfred Bion, there has been a major change in Kleinian theory. Essentially, aggression, rage, destructiveness, attacking is seen as following from failures of containment. Essentially, this is a frustration aggression theory, failures of early containment, which are not necessarily the mother's fault, the primary caretaker's fault, because there is such a thing as innate temperamental differences. A mother who might be perfectly well able to contain 3 of her infants, with the 4th, she's unable to do so. They can't get in sync for one reason or another, or perhaps the infant, for whatever reason, can't take in the goodness she offers. On the other hand, it may be that the failure of the containment is due to defective containment on the part of the primary caretaker, who may be depressed or narcissistic or whatever. So, but essentially, since Bion, Kleinian theory has tended to see pathology as rooted in early failures of containment, frustration, generating the aggression that is then projected and comes back as persecution. Splitting is a necessary achievement of the mind. It is necessary to split off an ideal breast from a persecutory breast. The ideal breast is built up through gratifying experiences of love. Once again, the myth that Klein ignores the real world, the real parenting, totally false. This is how the ideal breast is built up, through gratifying experiences of being loved and of loving. On the other hand, the persecutory breast is inevitably built up because of painful experiences of frustration. So on the one hand, we have the ideal object, the nurturer. On the other, we have the persecutor. And in my own work, of course, I associate the superego, as did Klein, the early superego, with the bad breast. It's an identification with the persecutor. Conscience, in my view, is an identification with the good breast, with the nurturer, reflecting depressive anxiety, or what Winnicott called the capacity for concern. That's what conscience is about. Superego is all about persecutory anxiety and need for punishment. Okay, it's necessary to protect the good object and the good self from the bad object and the bad self. Two ways to do this. One, you can project the bad out and keep the good in. That leads to paranoia. The projected badness is out there coming back to you as persecution. The second strategy is to project the good out and keep the bad in, keeping them separate, but putting the good for safekeeping out there in someone else. But the trouble with that is it depletes the self of all goodness, and it attributes that goodness to the other, who is then envied. Envied because the other now contains all of the goodness. The paranoid-schizoid position, the term schizoid, Klein adopted from Ronald Fairbairn, and of course we're not talking here about schizoid personality or schizoid character. The term schizoid simply means split, and it refers to the inevitable splitting of both the object and the ego. That she gets from Fairbairn. Whenever there is a splitting of the object, there is a corresponding splitting of the ego. So both ego and object are split. Schizoid and paranoid simply means the projection. Okay. As we saw when we discussed the Ridley Scott film Alien, the persecutor may be felt now outside as an external threat, and now inside, coming from inside. Elaine Showalter, some 20 years ago, published a book called Hysterias. She's an English professor, but her work is very compatible with Kleinian psychoanalysis. It had been thought that the old hysteria was like the famous glove anesthesia that fits the mental concept of the hand, but not the actual nerve pathways. Tics and paralyses of various kinds. The old hysterias that were studied by Charcot and Janet and Breuer and Freud, the idea was that these had disappeared, mainly for two reasons. Because they really constituted a body language resorted to primarily by women who couldn't speak. In patriarchal oppression, they were unable to speak their minds, so they evolved a body language to say what they couldn't say. But due to the rise of feminism, resort to this body language was no longer so necessary, so the rise of feminism. Secondly, psychoanalysis itself teaches us how to decode this body language. It's not a secret any longer what one is saying in this body language, and for these reasons it was thought the old hysterias disappeared. They never really did. I mean, the thought was that they were confined to so-called primitive populations, the Amish, the Mennonites, fundamentalist Christian rural groups, but that, in modern urban society, the old hysterias had disappeared. That's a myth. They never had disappeared. I had a patient who was a very modern man, flew his own plane, was always on his cell phone, He suffered from globus hystericus, the feeling that there was some kind of a ball of something in his throat preventing him from swallowing. So he would be at power lunches and he would have a mouthful and he would have to get up and go to the washroom and spit it out because he couldn't swallow, because obviously there was something going on in his life that he couldn't swallow. And without going into the details, what he couldn't swallow was his desire to swallow something that was an unacceptable urge for him. That's old hysteria. But Showalter draws attention also to the rise of the new hysterias: EI, environmental illness; MCS, multiple chemical sensitivity; CFS, chronic fatigue syndrome; alien abduction. There's a whole series of these so-called new hysterias. There's a wonderful film by the director Todd Haynes called Safe, about a woman, Carol White, no blackness, whatever, no dark side. But anyway, she believes she has environmental illness and is being made ill by various toxins in the environment. Okay, my wife and I have written a paper on this called Fugitives from Guilt, and we refer to these conditions as hysteroparanoid conditions to draw attention to the element of projection of the bad out and then persecution by various alleged external persecutors. But sometimes the persecutors are inside the body, and that simply produces that other form of hysteria called hypochondria. So back to Ridley Scott. The alien was outside in the pod, and then it smashed through the faceplate and it went inside the astronaut's body, and then over dinner it smashed through his chest cage out and scuttled off into the ship, and the rest of the movie is about Sigourney Weaver trying to eject it outside. But did she eject it? Is it still in the pod that she escapes from? Is it out? Is it in? Where is the alien? So we have people feeling persecuted from within. The baby inside them is persecuting them. The tapeworm inside, the viruses, the cancer that's killing me from inside, the compacted fecal matter that I have to get out of me through colonic cleansing. All these people purifying themselves by drinking water allegedly from Fiji in order to counteract all of the imaginary poisons inside. Obviously, all of this applies very much in the case of eating disorders. So, idealization of a good object, the building up of a good object, making it superlatively good in an attempt to make it impervious to harm. And so we have the classical definition of God as omnipotent, omniscient, and benevolent. Omnipotent, all-powerful; omniscient, all-knowing; benevolent, all good. All to make it so powerful that it can't be harmed. On the other hand, some people idealize the bad object. And so John Milton, classically in Paradise Lost, has Satan say, quotes, "Evil be thou my good." We know that in the death camp, some of the prisoners idealized the most sadistic guards and became their assistants. This is identification with the aggressor in the Anna Freud sense, which is very different from Ferenczi's sense. By identification with the aggressor, Ferenczi meant a hyper-attunement to the aggressor, to the abuser, to what he wants, so you can give him what he wants quickly, and in that way maybe save your life. But that's quite different from Anna Freud's sense of identification with the aggressor, which is literally becoming like the aggressor, becoming an aggressor. And one can see why people would identify with the aggressor, because the aggressor, although being evil, is powerful. and not helpless. So it's an escape from helplessness into a position of power, albeit bad power. When reality is too painful, when it's too persecutory, people often resort to defensive ego disintegration. This is an attempt to avoid anxiety by attacking the mind, by attacking the ego apparatus itself. It's like smashing the receiver so you won't have to hear the message. The ego is fragmented into bits, which are then projected, resulting in what Bion calls bizarre objects, which are bits of both the smashed object and the fragmented ego. So these are hostile fragments. And this really represents a multiplication of persecutors. There's not one bad object, but a swarm of bad objects. And so in the New Testament, Gospel according to Mark 5, verse 9, quotes, "Then Jesus asked him, 'What is your name?' 'My name is Legion,' he replied, 'for we are many.' Because there are many of us inside this man, fearing he will drive them out of the world and into the abyss, they beg him instead to send them into a herd of pigs, which he does. The pigs then rush into the lake and are drowned." Mark 5, 1-13. We are legion, a legion of demons. The bad object has been smashed and has multiplied. Okay, a point here comparing Bion with Kohut. For Bion, the fragmentation of the self is due to an attack on the ego, whereas for Kohut, the fragmentation-prone self suffers from a deficit of self-object function. So for Kohut, fragmentation is the result of absent self-object function. The self-object function that would hold the self together has been insufficient, and so the result is fragmentation. Very different conception in the case of Bion. The fragmentation is because a bomb has gone off, because a war has taken place, and the ego has been shattered by the forces of aggression and persecution. This is not a simple deficit model. This is fragmentation that is the result of intense, violent aggression turned against the mental apparatus itself. And this is how Bion understands and Siegel understands psychosis. Okay. Projection out leads to paranoia. Reintrojection of the persecutors leads to hypochondria. The persecutors are inside again. The projection of the good out leads to a depletion of the self and envy of others, because the others now contain the good that I've projected out. Claustrophobia. Here the writer is Donald Meltzer, his book The Claustrum. When we project ourselves too much into the other, we may end up feeling trapped inside the other. We've gone in, now we can't get out. In favorable conditions, again, the emphasis is on the real world, the real parenting, the real caretaking. When there are favorable conditions, anxiety is minimal, there is containment, and the infant gradually assimilates his ideal object. He gradually builds up his internal good object with which to identify. He can identify with its goodness and feel good about himself, thus integrating his ego and acquiring a sense of a good self linked to a good object. So the environmental circumstances are crucial. For this to happen, splitting is essential. The good has to be sorted out and protected from the bad, and this is a precondition of later integration. This splitting is the basis of distinguishing discriminating, and attending to this rather than that, paying attention to this and not paying attention to that. Things have to be separated, distinguished. We have to be able to distinguish friends from enemies. We have to be able to distinguish the edible from the inedible. We have to be able to distinguish situations of safety from situations of danger. We have to be capable of recognizing real evil when we come across it, and not be like Neville Chamberlain, who was so eager to have peace in our time that he was engaging in massive denial of the real evil threatened by Hitler. Meanwhile, Hitler's blitzkriegs are rolling into Poland and into Czechoslovakia until the denial finally broke down and evil was recognized. We have to be able to split. Liberal psychoanalysts don't like this. They see only the negative side of splitting. They see only the need to overcome splitting and achieve ambivalence and the depressive position. They don't see the adaptive necessity of splitting. We have to stop splitting about splitting. We have to be able to see both its adaptive and maladaptive, its good and its bad side. Splitting. It's an adaptive quality that we must achieve. We need to be able to recognize our enemies. Instead of just burying our heads in the sand. In other words, we need dialectical thinking, capable of both and. We need to overcome this undialectical early Kleinian model, which saw only a one-way arrow pointing from PS to D, which itself is splitting. It makes PS bad and D good. We need to recognize what's good in PS, and we need to recognize what's bad in D. So what's good in PS? The capacity to make distinctions, to recognize danger. Passion belongs to the paranoid-schizoid position. Falling in love belongs here. Commitment. Commitment in love, commitment in war belongs in the PS position. Here is where we form ideals. This is where the sacred resides. And I'm not speaking necessarily of religion here. Religion certainly celebrates what it considers to be sacred, but there is also the secular sacred, as my old mentor Eli Sagan reminded me. The secular sacred, the life of a child, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, democracy, equality, anti-racism, and so on. The sacred belongs in the paranoid-schizoid. Awe and reverence belong in PS. And what's bad in D? Mad rationality, a kind of crazy excessive rationality. Like in the 1950s, we had scientists calculating how many millions of deaths in a nuclear war with the USSR would be considered acceptable. Mad rationality. Or the kind of excessive rationality that sees all sides of everything, to the point where indecision, paralysis, fence sitting, you can't make a decision. Life in D can be excessively dispassionate, certainly not very sexy in D. So there's a downside to D and there's an upside to PS, and dialectical thinking tries to understand this. Ogden tried to get at this by defining mental health not as the advance from PS to D, but a kind of a flexible oscillating between PS and D, trying to somehow capture what's good in both. That's one way of trying to do it, make the arrow point both ways to suggest this idea of an oscillation. mental illness is a fixation either in PS or in D, different types of pathology, health being a flexible oscillation. I'm playing around with another attempt to be dialectical, and that is to suggest that there's a third area, Winnicott's transitional area, between PS and D. It's too dualistic. There are aspects of psychic reality that cannot clearly be assigned to either PS or D. They reside in this transitional area, a third area. Another way to try to get beyond the excessive dualism of PSD. Okay, turning now to Siegel's chapter 4, which is about envy. Freud, as we know, focused on penis envy. Klein is looking at envy as such, for example, men's envy of women. And in this connection, I recall my breast envy when my son was a baby and my wife was going out for a few hours, and before going she expressed some milk into a little tube that was in the fridge in case he woke up. And of course he did wake up and he was hungry, and I went to the fridge and I got the little tube and I gave him the milk, and it was great. Trouble was she was delayed and he woke up a second time and was hungry, and this time I didn't have any milk to give him. And at that point I realized what Ronald Fairbairn meant when he defined the father as the mother without breasts. Okay, envy. We can envy many things and many qualities. Envy is a two-body thing, to be distinguished from jealousy, which is a three-body phenomenon. In envy, I covet what another person has that I lack. Breasts, a womb, various abilities. It often leads, destructive envy leads to spoiling. If I can't have it, no one can. So we have the famous case in the 1990s of the Olympic skater Tanya Harding. She was afraid Nancy Kerrigan was going to defeat her. Her ex-husband hired a hitman to injure Kerrigan, bruising her kneecap, harming her tendon, preventing her from participating. Actually, Kerrigan did go on to win silver at the 1994 Olympic Games, but that's a perfect example of destructive envy leading to spoiling behavior. Envy is distinct from jealousy. Jealousy is a three-body thing. We seek to remove the rival so that the astronauts are hunting and trying to kill the alien because they've discovered that mother wants this alien, is willing to sacrifice them to bring the alien home, the alien being the new baby. And these are siblings who want to kill it out of jealousy. Greed aims to extract all goodness from the good object, regardless of the consequences. You consume the whole banana and then throw away the skin. Greed, the aim of greed is not destruction, unlike envy. Envy can lead to the aim of destroying what I can't have that someone else has. Greed doesn't want primarily to destroy. Destruction, if it happens, is incidental. Greed is more libidinal than envy. Envy is more destructive. Greed uses someone up, uses up all its good, casts whatever's left aside, and there's no gratitude. We saw that for Melanie Klein, the only therapy for envy is gratitude. She says Christians before meals pray for what we are about to receive. May the Lord make us truly thankful. She points out that this is not thanks for the food. This is asking to be given the capacity to feel gratitude, because gratitude is the only therapy for envy. It's also the only therapy for greed. To be able to celebrate the fact that my glass is half full and not bemoan all the time that it's half empty. Okay. Siegel writes in a way that almost equates envy with the death instinct. If the death instinct equals envy, then the death instinct equals an emotion, not a biologically based drive, the emotion of envy. In other words, it's psychological, not biological. Envy becomes a type of desire, not raw biological drive of any sort. Today, in addition to destructive envy, Kleinians recognize constructive envy, envy that inspires effort to develop in myself the qualities that I envy in the other. So if I envy my friend's tennis serve, instead of breaking his arm, I hire a tennis coach and work on my own serve until finally I can defeat him. That would be constructive envy that inspires effort. Envy can fuse with greed. We deplete the object so that there's nothing left to envy. Greed depletes the object of all of its goodness, so there's nothing left to envy anymore. Siegel suggests that in the more normal Oedipus complex, jealousy predominates. But in the pathological Oedipus complex, envy tends to be more important than jealousy. And this got me thinking about something I've noticed over the years, and that is the different ways that different men react to the discovery that their partner has been unfaithful. One type of man will want to punish her for her infidelity. The other type of man will want to kill her lover who has cuckolded him. Two different kinds of men. One wants to punish the unfaithful woman. The other wants to kill the rival male. Perhaps the first type, who wants to punish the unfaithful woman, is more driven by jealousy. Perhaps the second type, who wants to kill the rival, is more driven by envy. I haven't fully thought that through, but it occurs to me that that might be the case, one way to look at this. Early envy is particularly destructive because it can undermine the necessary splitting, which creates the first order of the mind, leading to psychotic confusion. Because if the good object goes bad because I envy it, I'm being hunted by the bad object. I try to run to the good object, but the good object is now bad because I envy it. So this can lead to total despair. Hunted by the bad, unable to seek rescue by the good, because the good is bad, because I envy it. So now we're in the territory of the negative therapeutic reaction, which Freud recognized and described, and linked it somehow to death instinct, but was very vague, really, about his explanation of what's going on. The analyst's good capacity is envied and attacked. His interpretations are spoiled. The patient has to wreck and undo any progress. Progress is dangerous because it leads to backlash. We see this in society. JFK, President Johnson had the program for the Good Society. They had a war on poverty, but this all got stalled because of the Vietnam War. And ever since, American society has displayed backlash. So we see this on the social level, but we certainly see it on the individual level. These patients who, as soon as they start to make progress, watch out, there's going to be a backlash. Bion points out that thinking is a kind of linking activity, a kind of coupling activity. And people who so envy the parental intercourse are so traumatized by the primal scene that they can't bear any coupling. These are people who can't think, because thinking is coupling, it's linking, it's connecting. So Bion describes attacks on linking, which undermine the capacity to learn from experience. The patient would rather ruin his analysis than give the envied analyst the feeling that he is good and capable and has something good to offer. Borderline patients, paranoid-schizoid patients, cannot conceive moderate progress or moderate success. They have to achieve complete perfection, or the only other alternative is total failure. It's either all good or it's all bad. And so if the patient feels that he's achieving perfection, he goes mad with grandiosity. The alternative is he's all bad, depressed, and potentially suicidal. There's the split. Vanity, Siegel points out, is the other side of envy and a defense against it. Vanity like grandiosity, a defense against envy. Invidiousness. I was so pleased when I discovered that word a few years ago. Invidiousness. An invidious person is someone who induces his or her envy in the other, essentially uses projective identification to put their envy into the other by bragging, showing off, evoking, making the others carry the shameful envy. But that leads to the negative consequence of now fearing the envious other. I've put all of my destructive envy into the other, and now I'm afraid of being envied by the other. So I'm hiding my light under a bushel. I'm hiding my successes because I fear the evil eye, the envious eye of the other. Various defenses against envy: spoiling, as we've seen, devaluing, Aesop's fables, sour grapes. The fox wants the grapes, but they're out of reach. He can't get them. He says, they're probably sour anyway. Rigid idealization. Put the person so far up, high, to protect them from your envy, but this doesn't work because the higher you put them up, the more your envy is stimulated by the idealization process. Projection of envy. Talked about projecting it into others. I think we can speak of projection of envy into the superego, creating an envious, destructive, attacking superego. A superego that attacks all of my achievements, devalues all of my achievements, devalues me. I prefer this way of understanding what some Kleinians are trying to get at with this concept of self-envy. I have trouble with that, but this idea of an envious superego makes more sense to me. Just a word here about the Kernberg-Kohut debate in the 1970s and early 80s. And in line with more Kleinian thinking, Kernberg understood idealization as a defense against destructive impulses. So if the patient is idealizing me, I am very suspicious that he's doing this in order to ward off a wish to kill me or destroy me or devalue me. Kohut sees idealization quite differently. He talks about patients who needed to idealize their mother or their father and got prematurely disillusioned. At the height of my idealization of father, a knock comes on the door and it's the police, and they take him away in handcuffs for embezzling from the bank. Traumatic disillusionment. Patient later comes into analysis and starts to idealize the analyst. For Kohut, this is an attempt to resume a normal developmental process that was derailed. It's not a defense against wishes to destroy, but rather an attempt to resume a developmental process. I think both Kernberg and Kohut get prizes because they're talking about two different categories of patients. Kernberg is talking about borderline patients who are full of anger and hate and are idealizing in order to defend against destructive wishes. And Kohut's describing adolescents, or usually people in their 20s, sometimes older, but often these patients are pretty easy to treat. They need to idealize you. You let them idealize you. They gradually discover you're human, and they get better, often in front of your eyes. They just needed to resume a simple idealization process. So they're both right. Different kinds of idealization. This is why psychodiagnosis is so important. We have to know what kind of patient we're dealing with in order to understand what the idealization is that we're getting. Okay. Self-idealization. Patients who resort to an extreme form of grandiosity. Sometimes this has been called the autarkic fantasy. Autarky, A-U-T-A-R-C-H-Y, autarky. Or the causa sui fantasy, the cause of myself. I am the cause of myself. I am my own father. I don't owe anything to anyone. I am beholden to no one. All dependence is denied. I need to thank no one. Late in his life, the analyst Erik Erikson was, I think, very unfairly attacked because, you know, his adoptive father, Homburger, he dropped that name. He never knew who his real father was. His mother kept lying to him about who the real father was. Homburger was Jewish and small and dark, and the mother was small and dark, and Erik was 6'2" and blonde. Never knew who his father was. Called himself Erik Erikson. Erik's son. And he was attacked for this attack on the father, the autarkic fantasy of causa sui. A final question before we leave envy, and I think it's a very important question. The Kleinians write as if the good object is envied for its very goodness. Is that really true? Or is it that the good object is envied because it is perceived as hoarding and refusing to share its goodness? Is it just the goodness, or is it the perception that the goodness is not being shared? Would a good object perceived as freely giving give rise to envy? I personally don't think so. I think there's a perception. Fairbairn tried to get at this by talking about the two faces of the bad object, exciting and rejecting. In Roman mythology, Tantalus, the tantalizing god, the tease, who stimulates your desire and then slams the door. Is this why the good object is envied and hated? Because it's seen as maliciously or greedily hoarding all of its goodness and refusing to share. That's a hypothesis more in keeping, I think, with self and relational theory, and I think I'm with them on that. Okay, turning now to Chapter 5, the psychopathology of the paranoid-schizoid position, and Siegel here is really talking about psychosis. She makes the point that psychosis is not fixation in a normal phase, an early normal phase of the paranoid-schizoid position. It's fixation in a phase where pathology has already taken place. In normal development, good experience predominates over bad experience. There's the environment again that Melanie Klein is supposed to be ignoring. This is the precondition for integration. Pathology arises when bad predominates over good in both the internal and for both internal and external reasons. Again, bad predominates not just because the caretaker is necessarily bad, although sometimes the caretaker is inadequate, but sometimes it's for internal reasons. The baby can't receive sometimes the goodness that's actually there. Sometimes the goodness isn't there. Bion is speaking here in dealing with psychosis, not with normal projective identification, which is the basis of empathy. I put myself into your shoes in order to come to understand how you feel. That's healthy, normal projective identification, the basis of empathy. He's talking about a pathologically violent projective identification in which the object is splintered, the object is attacked, is splintered, the ego is splintered along with the object, splintered into minute fragments, and then projected into the object, disintegrating it further. So this is violent projective identification. Since reality is experienced as persecutory, reality is hated. The ego is splintered in order to get rid of all perception. The mind itself is attacked. So both the subject and the object are attacked. When envy is intense, the perception of a good object is as painful as the experience of a bad object. There's no tidy split, but we have all of these bits, each containing a hostile part of the ego. These are the bizarre objects. And this is an attempt by the ego to get rid of pain, but it only leads to more pain. And in a very broad sense, this is what Bion is saying. Pathology results from an early decision to try to base your life on evading pain. And at some point in a good analysis, the patient has the opportunity to revisit and to decide differently, to choose to base his life not on the evasion of pain, but on the bearing of it, learning how to tolerate pain rather than always be trying to escape it. Because the attempt to get rid of pain leads to more pain. So we attempt to chop off the monster's head, it immediately grows 10 more. In the film, the Ridley Scott film, Alien, the more the astronauts hunt it, the more the alien grows and multiplies. Sometimes, Siegel says, the bizarre objects are projected into a split-off third area. They're fenced off in this third area, apart from what remains of a functional ego and object. The surviving remaining ego and the remaining object continue to exist, splitting off the bad objects into a third area. She gives some examples of this. It makes me think of perversion. I think that certain perversions defend against psychosis rather in this way. The bizarre objects are split off into this third perverse area, which somehow serves as a defense against a complete psychotic disintegration. So Bion writes about attacks on linking. Any function or organ that links objects together is attacked, mouth and nipple. But I recently published an article in Psychoanalytic Discourse called Attacks on Separating. Not because I want to devalue Bion's idea of attacks on linking, it's just that he only tells half the story, because the mind operates by both separating and linking, distinguishing and comparing. The mind is composed of both differences and similarities, and it's necessary to study both. So there are two ways to attack the mind and attack reality. One is to attack links. The other is to attack boundaries. Bion has a bias towards eros. He privileges linking over separating. This is, we could call, a feminine bias, as these things are sorted out by patriarchy. There's no particular reason that we have to see it this way, but traditionally, eros, linking, feminine bias. This is the bias of the self and the relational people, and they like Bion for this reason. They share his eros bias. On the other hand, we have the masculine bias of the Freudians and Lacanians, who are all about the law of the father, boundaries, maintaining the strict frame of the analytic situation. There's a bias towards saying yes, the linkers, a bias towards saying no, the separators. Obviously, we need to be able to say both yes and no. This is dialectical thinking again. We need to be able to work both sides of the street. We need to be able to mother our patients. We need to be able to father our patients. But analysts do have a bias towards one or the other. And it's part of an analyst's development is this capacity to evolve this bisexual orientation, if you want to call it that way. Think of it that way. Okay. Links are attacked, says Bion. In schizophrenia, the perceptual apparatus is attacked, and the patient is surrounded by disintegrated, hostile objects, bizarre objects. We've already talked about positive projective identification, which leads to envy, because I deplete myself of goodness and put it all into you and then envy you. She ends the chapter by talking about how patients use the analyst as a kind of toilet container into which bad objects can be poured. But there are three possibilities. The analyst is unaffected, and the process is blocked. If the analyst is unaffected by the patient's projections, then the process is blocked. The analysis can't really work. Second situation, the analyst is affected, and the patient sees how his projection is affecting the analyst, and the patient may show some concern, but pretty soon the analyst is going to be perceived as a persecutor, pouring the bad that had been poured into him back out into the patient, reprojecting in a vengeful sense. The patient is experiencing the analyst as vengefully reprojecting. And then there's the third situation. The analyst is affected but is able to contain without reprojection. And this leads to relief, but it also leads to envy. How come the analyst is so magnificent that he's able to be affected and contain it and not reproject it? Is he a saint? There's a wonderful, wonderful paper by Epstein called Uses of Hate in the Countertransference, where he says too many analysts have been influenced by the bishop in Les Miserables. Valjean, the criminal, is saved by the bishop's goodness. He's stealing from the bishop, and the gendarme arrests him, and the bishop says, "Oh, he didn't steal. I made him a gift." And Valjean is transformed by this act of grace, of goodness on the part of the bishop. And so a lot of us become analysts, thinking that, like the bishop, we're going to cure through love. And maybe that can work to some extent on patients who aren't so ill. But then we encounter this type of patient who just gets worse and worse and worse in the face of our goodness, our forbearance, our empathy. It drives them crazy. They're busy attacking us, and we're remaining non-retaliatory, and the patient is thinking, what, is he stupid? Doesn't he understand I'm shitting all over him? Or is he just, is he too dumb to get it? Or is he a bloody saint? Is he just inhumanly good? And if he's so good, that makes me just feel cosmically inferior and stimulates my destructive envy even more. Winnicott knew something about this because he writes of patients who he says can only begin to believe in our love once they find and encounter our hate. Only then can they begin to believe that we're real. Okay, that's it. Next week, we're going to move on into chapters 6, 7, and 8 of Siegel.